Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We'll wait just a couple more minutes here. I see a few people logging on. Nice to see some familiar, well, I'll say I see more names than I do faces, but nice to see you all. Maybe while we're waiting for a few more people to join, we'll go through a little bit of friendly housekeeping. So we've as kind of normal, we've put everybody to mute, just for gentle reminder. Please do use the chat box throughout. We have a couple areas set for questions, but love questions along the way. Definitely please do use it. We love to get your questions. Thank you. And the webinar will be recorded, and we'll share a link to that and send that out. So thanks again for participating, for joining us today, and look forward to the conversation. So with that, I would love to introduce our panel speakers. We have Kevin Franklin, who's the Chief Executive Officer of EiQ. He's been with LRQA for around about a decade now. I probably should have asked him before we started the call, but around about a decade, I'd say, and has a long history working in human rights and sustainability and biodiversity, a whole number of different things, a lot of it centered around data. So really excited to have him here today as the brainchild behind EiQ. We also have Jennifer Winter, who's our Associate Director and leads our operations for responsible sourcing in the Americas. For those of you that don't know Jen, get to know her, please. She's wonderful, especially if you're trying to do work in the US. She's been in kind of auditing and social compliance for, I'd say, around about 2 decades. She started with a small, at least in this life, I should say, started with a small kind of boutique consulting and auditing firm, was so passionate about auditing that she then started her own auditing firm. This is going back a long time ago, even when we were around, for those of you that know our entire history, when we were Level Works before we were Elevate and then LRQA. So that's when she was doing her own auditing firm, then became a part of Elevate and is now leading our US operations just in the last 6 months or so. So really excited to have her on with us to show her insights from the ground. And then myself, for those of you that don't know me, I'm a principal in responsible sourcing here at LRQA. I've been working at LRQA also in responsible sourcing for about 12 years at this point. So know many of you and always excited to be meeting new people. My passion is really just helping understand where your worries, where your risks are, how we can help drive impact and meet you where you are and innovate together. So in terms of what we'll be covering today is just a brief overview of some of the key risk drivers in the US, why we've all been focused on the US, and to some degree, do we expect that in the future, the evolving risk landscape. A couple insights then from Jen from a practitioner's viewpoint. We'll shift to Kevin, who will be talking about some of the data that we've integrated into EiQ at a state level, so that we can really hone in on where our highest risk is as we're all working in a resource-constrained world. And then, as we go deeper into that, and also some actionable recommendations, and of course, some more Q&A. So look forward to the next hour. Thanks again all for joining. So when we think about the US and, its prevalence within all of our minds, I'd say, in discussions over the last few years, the expansion of our programs into the US, the investments that we've made in the US, there's, a lot of different reasons. But if we step back and look at where we are today, I say they fall generally into three major buckets, right? So we have actually starting back at the first Trump administration, a real focus on pride in U.S. manufacturing. We saw, tariffs for the first time, or at least kind of these very significant tariffs coming into play. You might remember there's a lot of shifting of manufacturing to Southeast Asia, as well as the focus on the domestic manufacturing and nearshoring. We also then, and then of course that has just only resounded even more in his second term, right? As we focus on, again, the nearshoring, again, the domestic manufacturing, on the tariffs over the subsequent years as well. After his first administration, we of course saw, an influx of regulations and sanctions, whether was withhold release orders, which of course affected different sectors, different countries, whether that was introduction of legislation such as the UFLPA, the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, or some of the other emerging human rights due diligence laws around the globe, all of this was encouraging companies to consider where they're sourcing and how much they're actually saving in wages versus doing it here in the U.S. or nearshoring to the U.S. And then, of course, as I was saying, with the tariffs on within the advent of the first 6 months of the new Trump administration. Over the last couple of years as well, obviously, there's been a lot of media on the U.S. I think shocking to many of us, and to the degree the prevalence that we see of some issues such as child labor. I'll talk about that more in just a second, but I think that has been a big shock, and it's taken a lot for us to help educate our peers and our companies on what that looks like, what that means. But there's been, outside of child labor, there's also been freedom of association, discrimination, other types of human rights investigations as well that have been front and center in the media. And then we also have currently really a big shifting of administration policies. And obviously, this is a little bit more of a Pandora's box, but as we're driving to build a more efficient and deregulated government, in addition to the focus on the immigration policies and the child labor and this type of thing, the international, we're also seeing a defunding of a number of agencies that are quite adjacent to our work, right? So the defunding or kind of more limited funding of OSHA, more limited funding of the EPA. There is currently a bill and legislation that would further make obsolete or reduce additional 60 workforce regulations. These range on a variety of topics, and many especially nuanced, right? But minimum wages in certain areas, less protections on exposure to harmful chemicals. We also see things like farm workers potentially not being able to aren't protected from retaliation if they make a complaint. We see things like governance boards, such as the U.S. Chemical and Health Safety Board, potentially going away. For those of you that remember, a few years ago in Louisiana, there was a number of explosions around a petrochemical complex. So those are the types of sites and manufacturing sites that are typically managed, or the compliance is managed by these organizations, and there is a reduction in those, or potential reduction in some cases, in those agencies. So what that ultimately does is, of course, puts the onus of the upholding of our codes of compliance, codes of conduct, and the compliance with those more solidly with the private sector, right? So this one's looking a little bit more into the future, but it's a little bit more of the same, and definitively look where we're headed the next 4 years, from what it seems, from the changes that we've already seen. In terms of child labor and some of the media exposure that we've seen on that one, if you want to go ahead and skip to the next slide, this, I think even several months ago, we were saying, is this still the highest risk? Obviously the last couple of years, it was a huge change in that there was these large penalties being assessed on the private sector. JBS, I think the final settlement was something around $8 million, right, of penalties. This is unheard of 5 years ago, right? Whereas now it was almost commonplace since 2022 as a leverage point. With all the focus on immigration, some of the questions we were having is this still going forward? I actually had the opportunity to speak with David Fortney, who some of you, I know, Matt, we had hosted a workshop in Washington, D.C. earlier this year focused on U.S. Sourcing risks. And he spoke at that event. He has a number of close ties to the administration, and was saying that there's currently, this is when I was speaking with him this week, there's currently kind of a law or legislation that will very likely be passed. It's being sponsored by Cory Booker and Josh Hawley, who are on very opposite ends of the spectrum. And they're both focused on, this legislation is focused on, increasing penalties to the private sector for finding child labor in their supply chains, right? So a little bit more of the same on this one, but again, that's the indicative direction that we're headed from the best sources that we have, and of course what we're seeing day in and day out in the factories. So, if we were to read the tea leaves, we'd say, yes, we need to continue investing in our responsible sourcing in the risk in the U.S. But I think what's challenging for that is how do we do that? Where do we start? Where are the biggest risks? How do we protect ourselves, et cetera? So those are some of the things we hope you get out of this webinar today. Again, please do chime in with questions. But with that, I think I'll turn it over to Kevin to talk a little bit about just the data and what we're seeing, and not just the anecdotal policies.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you for having me. I'll do this maybe with a very brief initial anecdote or two, because we have a lot more to discuss as we go through the session. But for those listening, I think of this call really in three parts, kind of the past, the present, and the future. Megan's given a great update on what's happened so far. I'm going to kind of reinforce that a little bit with some of the findings that we've had from our on-the-ground audit work during really 2024. And obviously, Jen's going to share the present of what it's like on the ground, and then we'll talk about some of the risk insights, how they predict maybe specific emerging challenges for businesses, and obviously that feeds into the future and how, from a business perspective, one needs to adjust your programs, the design, etc., accordingly. But kind of speaking again to the past a little bit, as Megan was saying, the policy landscape, how that has changed, and what is now really the existent operating environment in the US with a lot more home shoring, increasingly topical home shoring, means that as businesses, we really need to be navigating a completely new and more challenging risk profile. If we look back at the audit data from 2024, and you can see some of the highlights of these on the top right-hand side, we've called out here really just four: forced labor, humane treatment, working hours, and injuries. And they feed into really why the US, from our perspective, from an audit data perspective, is showing as a high risk country. Humane treatment, for those that aren't aware, really covers disciplinary practices, discrimination, harassment or abuse, pregnancy testing, and equivalent sorts of metrics. And we've seen the US be flagged as kind of a high risk country for these. Forced labor, as I think some of you all know, the US is one of the few countries that allows legally forced overtime. Now, I'm sure Jen will talk to this, because even though it's allowed, of course, it does need to be compensated at an additional 1.5 times salary. So we'll talk about that and how that's tracked, reported on, and measured through the assessment process, and obviously as part of your own protocols. But when we get into the detail of this session, we will really go into some of the specific underlying risk indices that we've constructed, leveraging data around severe injuries, feeding into our really forward-looking thoughts around injuries. We'll also look at data sets around minors, and we'll look at data sets around human trafficking. Whilst what you're seeing on this page shows really an overall score for the US, I think our real concern is about what's happening subnationally, the differences that we're seeing state by state, and how, as a business, you need an adjusted program that is really reflective of those specific nuances when you roll out audits or other sorts of activities on the ground. So maybe I'll pass back to you, Megan, and we can go to the next part of the session, and we'll delve much deeper into data as we kind of navigate the remaining time together.
Sure. I would love to have, Jen, you just have a few thoughts, high level, from your insights from doing audits yourself, from leading the team. What are you seeing on the ground?
Yep. Thank you so much. Again, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it. So I think what's really interesting is if we look at how client programs have evolved, let's say over the past 5-6 years, I think there was always a lot of talk around looking at what I would say non-traditional suppliers. You could say that this intention was pre-pandemic. I think there was always a little bit of a blind spot to say it isn't just tier one. We have to get out of tier one. We have to go to our tier two. We need to look at these we need to look at suppliers beyond, the ones that we think beyond the traditional set. And we have seen a number of clients that I think because of the pressures and because of a lot of the reporting start to go in that way. So we've done a number of really interesting projects with service providers, logistics providers. We do more interesting projects on I-9s and I-9 audits, specifically because immigration is a a really large issue in the US, specialized focused audits or investigations, so on child labor, prison labor. And we've also been seeing a lot of shifts into thinking about like the audit time, are we covering third shift where we had the JBS and then other news articles and that have come out to say like, that's where the risk is. And yes, that's definitely much seen in the data. The risk is out there. So that. I think what we've done, and I think that's the larger landscape of what customers have been thinking of, in the direction of their programs is looking at these different types of tools. So we've actually also done a lot of work, I think, to try to address or capture these issues, knowing that in the past, we probably haven't had the right team in place to do that. And that's specifically why I was put in place. So as of last year, when I came into this role, I have a US based team, 15 plus auditors and counting. We have a mix of, CSCA, mid-experienced, and then also new auditors coming in. That's important for the industry. We have to address that there's not enough social auditors. So it's really important that we keep training new people and we keep growing the team. But it's been really important, not just to make sure we have a good US team, but also making sure we have the support of really great reviewers. So localized reviewers who are also auditors and have audit background, CAP managers and schedulers. So over the last year, let's say 6 months, that was my main, first thing was to get that handled. Then the next piece I've really got into once we've, mostly addressed capacity, though we're still growing. And that's important that we still keep growing because I think there's a lot more work to be done there. Is actually the second piece is really the technical calibration. So, really looking at all of these risks that we're seeing, our assessment manual, are the things that we're asking customers, was it fit for purpose? So I really went back with the team and said, I really wanted us to go back to the basics. Like, what are we doing as auditors? What was the point of us? Like, what are we trying to accomplish, and making sure we're pivoting in the right direction. So really focusing on labor issues and asking the right questions and being not afraid and having the team feel really empowered to say when they get an audit that's really too big and they go on site, but they find something serious, that they say, I need to focus on this. This is kind of serious. I'm just going to let the client know this is where we need to go. And letting the team be flexible in that. And also, transitioning the team to be less focused, to be a little bit more investigative. And we probably throw around these terms a lot, like checklist auditing versus investigative auditing, and what's the difference between those. But having auditors to be a little bit more like flexible, instead of it just being you're doing an exercise of going down a list and making sure I'm hitting all of it, to actually doing the real work to get at the answers that our customers are really looking for us to do. We've also done, in particular, really calibrated the team on certain interpretation of laws and customers and standards. So that was really important to us in using the data that we have from our past experiences of being in the field where we know things are. So we've really highlighted like freedom of association. That's obviously, one of the very sensitive issues of auditing in the US. And, you want to train the team to understand. I think there's a big difference between making sure, like some customers, there's a big difference between what customers are asking us to do on freedom of association. So it's some customers may say, they just don't want us to violate workers' right to freedom of associate, versus some customers may say, we need to ask workers to be educated on their rights and confirm their understanding and make sure they're educated at time of hire. And I think those are very different asks. I think it happens as an auditor. You think all standards are the same because we do, hundreds of audits a year. All the auditors do so many audits a year, but really taking time to understand those differences and making sure that we're really catching and capturing those things. And conveying that to our customers. So I think that was a really, that issue is also, as Kevin mentioned earlier, is mandatory overtime and working hours. When in my previous life as regional manager, I actually did have guidance on mandatory overtime and working hours, thinking about like a kind of a gradient approach to it. Because I think it's actually a really nuanced approach, because it's something very different between mandatory overtime, where they may ask you to do mandatory 5 hours on a Saturday once a month, versus mandatory overtime if they like something overseas where they bar the windows and don't let you out, you know, or 80 hours per week, or how do we handle mandatory overtime in a union environment when it's often incorporated into the contract? So just working with the team to understand those subtleties. Yes, sorry, Megan.
Great. Sorry, I do see a few questions coming in. So one was
please.
where, maybe just an example or two on the biggest disconnects you see on interpretations of law. You said you've had to do a lot of calibration on interpretation of law. Where were the biggest disconnects? Especially, obviously, with our hiring of so many different auditors, obviously many of them have been different audit firms before too, right? And so it's interesting that interpretation of law would be applied differently. So maybe just quickly an example or two.
Well, I was going to say probably one of the very pertinent to this discussion is probably I-9 and immigration procedures. So talking about like what are the requirements? What do we consider reasonable due diligence, and making sure that auditors are having those conversations with management. Because I think there's a difference between asking like, oh, I think you have hiring procedures that are great, but really delving into how does a company, and asking that question, how do you ensure reasonable due diligence when it comes to immigration? We've also done some work around that were a little bit outside of our original like remit, I would say, of social audits, is actually being trained on looking at IDs. How do we know that they're real, or how do you know that they're false? So we've done technical training on that.
Interesting. And I just have this one's a really interesting question. And then I do think we need to move on because we're we're getting a lot of interesting information. But what is it like to be an auditor right now?
I think once in a while you come across people that have more aggressive personalities, I'll say in the nicest way possible. But I do think, honestly, by and large, 99% of the people that you meet when you audit in the US still are quite lovely. I do think social media kind of echo chambers anger that may or may not exist when you talk to normal people in a professional environment. But I think my most, like I said, 99% of the experiences have been quite positive. I actually think the industry has moved quite a bit, in the sense that, when I audited 10 years ago versus now, I actually do think a lot of the more mature companies are quite prepared. They're quite prepared for, so they come on site, they're ready to go, and they're really interested. I think the main, contention or the main issue is always like, suppliers want to make sure that these assessments and the work that they're doing is valuable to them. So can't waste their time. And they have to, and it has to align in some ways to their ideals. But I do think in a lot of ways it does. And if you talk to them as normal people and say, we just want to make sure workers are safe and they're treated well, they go, oh, that makes sense. Of course I would have participated in this, and I want to be better. So I do think that those aligned.
Great.
Yeah.
Sorry, did I cut you off? Is there one more thing you were going to add, Jen?
Yeah, I was going to say, however, responsible sourcing auditing is always kind of about moving the needle. And so I do think one area, and as we talked about, that we're going to have to really realign on expectations, is like how suppliers kind of manage contractors, co-manufacturers, labor agencies, service providers, because in the traditional auditing sense, I do think that's where the spot is, and we're going to have to push them a little bit. I do think companies are going to be like, well, I hired them to do a job, I expect them to comply. But we're saying, well, it doesn't matter because you expected them and they didn't do it. So how do you, take the next step to make sure that that happens, so it doesn't risk your business either?
Great. Thanks, Jen. A lot to take in. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Kevin, who is going to take us through, when we're looking at risk. For many of us, we're either expanding our programs to cover more of our supplier base in the US, or maybe for some of us, we're standing up a responsible sourcing program for the first time in the US. So turn over to Kevin to talk through a little bit more, where are the states with the highest risks and what are those risks? So to give us some guidance on, where to start, basically. Kevin, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. Going back to my earlier comment about kind of how I'm thinking of this session or this conversation really in the context of past, present, and future, we know a lot of you on the call are trying to predict, right, where are the problems likely to occur and what will those problems look like. And the indices we're going to discuss now, I think we can sort of layer on top of what Jen has just said in terms of some of the things she's seeing as a means to maybe think about what might come down the line and therefore what auditors and how programs should be structured accordingly. So to facilitate that degree of prediction around what we might see in supply chains, particularly in the US, we launched earlier this year 9 state-level indices specifically focused on the US. These are not present for any other countries at the moment. But I'm going to talk to 3 of those indices. There's obviously a lot more information that we can share offline, and please do reach out if you're interested. But the 3 I'll talk to are unaccompanied minors, occupational safety and health, and then human trafficking. So let's maybe just move on to the next slide and talk about the unaccompanied minors index specifically, which really has 4 component parts. And one of the first component parts is really the concept of unaccompanied alien children. This is a phenomenon I'm sure many of you on the call are aware of. And over the last few years, we've had hundreds of thousands of unaccompanied alien children or unaccompanied minors coming into the US. We'll talk a bit about the gender breakdowns of those children in a second. But what this really means, this definition, UAC or unaccompanied alien children, is a child under the age of 18 with no lawful immigration status in the US, and also, very important, no parent or legal guardian in the US, or no parent or legal guardian that has come across the border with that child. For those of you that are asking this question in the background, the majority of these unaccompanied children come from countries such as El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and some from the Northern Triangle in Mexico, often fleeing what are situations of violence, poverty, and unstable local conditions. So the data set we've drawn on is a data set that was published by the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Health and Human Services. And essentially what sits within this data set is information around country of origin. I've mentioned a few examples: gender, day of entry, date of release, and then relationship with sponsor, which is critical. But also critical is the zip code, the release location, because it's that location which will help us understand more about where these risks are likely to occur within your supply chain. So we've combined that data together with a few other data sets, which I'll share in a second, to really generate a subnational picture on the next slide, showcasing which are the states we see as kind of highest and lowest risk. And what this now reflects is not just unaccompanied alien children, but really vulnerability. So what you're seeing on this visual is an index of vulnerability patterns that combines multiple different risk indicators I'll talk through with you shortly. As a result of that, we can see very clearly some of the kind of high risk states. In all cases, we've color coded these states: extreme, high, medium, and low, red, amber, yellow, green. Top 5 lowest risk states: New Jersey, New York, etc. And then on the kind of highest risk side would be Mississippi, Idaho, Tennessee, etc., as you can see as well, kind of on the right-hand side of the slide. Now, let me talk through with you a little bit about kind of the underlying root causes and drivers for this, and specifically what those gender breakdowns look like, where and how these children are released, and some of the factors that influence their vulnerability. So on the next slide, if you don't mind taking us through to that one, what we can see is some of the gender distribution by state. Now, interestingly, most of these unaccompanied minors are actually male children. So roughly 60-40 split male-female. And there is a strong pressure to process them through the system very quickly. So the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, that typically is responsible for some of that processing, is increasingly processing children within a minimum or a maximum, I guess, of 26 to 35 days. But there's a pressure to release large numbers of children each week. And this rushing of the process can potentially create additional vulnerabilities. What's interesting here is not just the kind of rushing and the release patterns, but also an understanding of where those children are going and when they land up in those locations of vulnerability, whether they're more or less predisposed to exploitation, which is exactly what we're then looking to try and understand when it comes to program design. So what we do know is that children that are released to sponsors can often be sponsors that could be family members, could be distant relatives, but could also be others who may have been named as a sponsor in advance and may be, let's say, less scrupulous and looking to basically exploit children in the workforce in various different situations, heightening their exposure and exploitation risks. What we are also quite sensitive to, and there's been some analysis on this, is whether children are going to states or cities that have more or less migrants. So are they going into a community that is populated with a strong level of migrant workers of a similar type or of migrants of a similar type and coming from a similar country? It's unclear whether this makes things better or worse. In some cases, it may give them a stronger sense of support, a better support system, and enable them to better assimilate locally. In other situations, they maybe come into essentially networks that have already been set up to manipulate traffic or potentially take them into kind of more vulnerable positions, whether it's sexual exploitation or kind of other forms of the kind of more serious and vulnerable states. But what we've done is we've taken this underlying unaccompanied alien children data, as you can see on the next slide, and that really is factored into the first part of what is our unaccompanied minors index. We've linked that information around the non-parent sponsor data that I've just spoken to, as well as the country of origin itself in the middle block. And we've looked at the country of origin in terms of things like secondary education enrollment, child rights in the workplace, child labor, political stability, to really give us an idea of the degree of vulnerability that a child may come into the country with, right? Have they been well educated? Have they come from a violent environment? Are they therefore more likely to be open and naive to a situation that could lead to exploitation? We've combined that with Human Rights Watch data around the Children Rights Compliance Index, which you can see on the right-hand side, that is also subnational in the US. And ultimately, all of that data has fed into the visual that you saw on the slide a couple of slides ago, reflecting the different state level vulnerabilities. I won't go too much into the next slide, but maybe just briefly for those of you that are interested, and you'll definitely have access to these slides offline. We've also looked at and really dissected all of this by state. So you can see an example here for Mississippi in the middle and the origin countries that are coming into that particular state. And we have also evaluated their compliance with the kind of Human Rights Watch data, again, also by state. So there's a lot of detailed information behind here, all of which kind of feeds into the toolkits that our auditors use when they're on site to evaluate vulnerability and to really ensure that the audits we're delivering and the other services we're delivering are kind of best prepared. So let me move quickly on to the Occupational Safety and Health Reports Index. I'm going to go very fast here because I'm conscious of time. So we've taken a similar kind of logical framework to constructing an index, in this case around occupational safety and health. You can see we've also prepared this at a state level, creating standardized safety scores, measuring and comparing occupational hazard patterns across the states. On the next slide, you can see some of the data that has flown into that. So we've leveraged a lot of information from the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, again, as I said, subnational. So this means looking at almost 100,000 severe injury reports, data around workers that have been hospitalized and workers with really the most severe injuries, including amputations. So looking at that data, firstly, collating it and compiling it by state, looking at the fatality inspection data, and then also evaluating penalties and how and if penalties have been imposed. All of these different information sources have come together to drive and then inform the kind of subnational scores for both fatalities, as you can see on the next slide, and also amputation incidents, again, also available kind of on the next slide, ultimately feeding into kind of an aggregate score around occupational safety and health reports. And much more data behind this, again, feeding into the kind of audit frameworks that our teams use on the ground. One more quick index update before I kind of go back to the team to talk about next steps and implications is the index of human trafficking. So this is the third one, and this is obviously also very critical to informing risk and program design. The human trafficking index that we're showing here, again, also subnational, uses data from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, supported by the Administration for Children and Families. So this is part of the Department of Health and Human Services as well. And this data set really draws on tens of thousands of cases that have been logged and tracked and also reported subnationally. The breakdown, again, similar to the previous, if you can take us onto the next slide, is subnational, but also split by gender, male and female, and also looks at the type of trafficking activity, whether it's labor trafficking, sex trafficking, etc. So all of that has fed into kind of a heat map showing which are the highest risk states, just as we've discussed previously. One last quick comment. Not only have we used the actual trafficking data, as you can see on the next slide, but we've also combined that with information coming from the FBI itself around crime data linked to human trafficking in order to kind of comprise that really compound view of human trafficking risk and risk to business as well. So with that, maybe I'll pass back to the team to talk about best practice and how we respond to these issues.
Sure, Kevin, just a quick question on interpretation of the data, one that I've heard from clients. So when you're looking at that last slide, for example, and it says the number of cases, in our indices, when we're looking at them live on EiQ, do they account for that? Is it normalized?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. In all cases, we look at the number of cases relative to the total population within that particular state in order to ensure that it's normalized. That's completely right. Thank you for flagging, Megan.
Yep, thanks. Cool. So with that, if we can go to the next slide. So I think, we've heard a lot from Jen of what she's seen on the ground. We've heard a lot from Kevin in terms of what the data is saying. But when I think about the clients that we're working with that are trying to figure out exactly what to do, where to invest in terms of their program, despite, the various different levels that they are in terms of their US programming, it still comes back to our kind of ESG or human rights, due diligence kind of workflow, right? So the first one is really the diagnostic. And for the US, I'd say this is a really significant piece of work, right? This is a little bit different. Even if you have a very large responsible sourcing program, expanding and or like the hardest part is standing one up to begin with, right? Expanding is much easier than standing it up. So, first is the gap analysis of, does our code of conduct cover key issues, right? Something that it has come up is prison labor covered to what degree? It's a little bit different in the US than in other countries, and it has a little bit more media exposure, again, in a different way. So that's one gap I know that some companies have identified, but just in terms of over time, what are our policies on that, being that there are different allowances in the US. So some of these types of things in the code of conduct, gap analysis and review, where do you really want to focus as an organization, right? I think the biggest focus across the board is on kind of child labor, abuse of vulnerable workers. But the child labor, it's all very linked, right? And so that is definitely where we see most companies focusing in on. I think something interesting that Jen has actually talked about in the past is, we do these audits that are 200 checkpoints or 300 checkpoints in the US. The findings that we're concerned about, we're not finding a lot of things on health and safety in general. Obviously, there's the OSHA reports to understand where those are highest risk, but depending on which supplier you're working with, a lot of times there's very sophisticated management systems on that type of thing, right? The risk is actually with the service providers, with the contractors, with the hiring practices, with the due diligence on the hiring practices. So is that where we want to focus, and what does that look like in terms of a program? Ambition and determination. People have always said, social compliance, sustainability, it had a lot of different names, but it's a team sport, right? And so getting all of your different internal stakeholders on board to understand what the risks are in the US and what they look like is actually much harder, right? And sometimes it can be a lot more sensitive when it's close to home than when it's, across an ocean or two. So this is actually a really hard part as well. Supply chain risk footprint. So using the data or a subset of the data that Kevin has shared based on where your focus areas are, where is your supply chain relative in the US, which states, and then where do you want to focus given your supply chain and the risks? And then, of course, the corporate training that goes with it. So that diagnostic piece is actually quite comprehensive for the US, I'd say. I think it's not like you're taking your program and now we're going into Myanmar, so we're going to include Myanmar as a high-risk country or something like that, right? It's very different in terms of, and I think all of you as practitioners know this, but it's a lot of work. So with that, maybe I'll turn it over to Kevin to talk a little bit about box 1 and 2, is I think that's really where EiQ and some of the data comes in.
Thanks, Megan. You've covered a number of these points already, but maybe just on box 1, which is all about mapping and screening, and let's just talk to the screening part. Jen mentioned the mapping part already, but on the screening side, we've historically looked a lot, and I'm sure you all do this already, at whether sanctions have been applied to a particular supplier to help us make a decision around whether to proceed with them or not. But increasingly, we need to take more data into consideration as part of that screening activity. And things like grievance mechanism data or things like NGO data or other records, a lot of which we build into our EiQ platform and our adverse media scanning tool Sentinel, are very relevant. Now, this is particularly the case in the US because there's a lot of information in the public domain, and that's increasingly the case, a lot of information in the public domain. So I would say as part of your initial screening, make sure that you really leverage those sources in the public domain in order to make really clear and well-informed decisions about when you're moving forward with the existing or a new supplier. For new, it's pretty clear, right? That'll help you inform whether you do or don't bring them on board. For existing, it will help you determine the frequency of your audit program and potentially also, to Megan's point, what audit tools you're going to use with that particular supplier. We'll talk about different audit tools that may be being applied in a second. So that's the kind of screening piece, really important because you will need to keep a much more watchful eye on what's going on in supply chains. This isn't a once a year activity. You need to be constantly tracking and tracking. Secondly, on the risk assessment, similar sort of logic. I mean, Megan already spoke to the fact that this needs to be subnational. It needs to be very nuanced. I think it can also look at the present and the future, right? Some of the topics we've mentioned a second ago do give us leading insight into the likely future risks, but they also feed into thinking about, again, program design. So the unaccompanied minors index is very important because, we might see these sorts of issues in your supply chain, but the reality is it's probably unlikely that your suppliers are going to directly hire children, certainly 13, 14, that are migrant workers, right? It's more likely that they may come in through a service provider arrangement or a labor agent, or they might be working a late night shift and in a less regulated environment. And we know that 53% of the suppliers we visit in the US are actually using labor agents to support them in the recruitment process. So to Megan's point, that's a really key differentiator versus a standard program design, right? Using some of these data sets to inform a more nuanced and focused program design to get at the risks will be super important. And that's just one example. Subnational, more nuanced, different audit tools being applied to address those specific risks. Thank you, Megan.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. And just I guess one question on that, as we've developed all of these risk indices, how do you see those given the wider context of what we've outlined so far and all the work that that the various companies are doing?
Sorry, was that for me?
Yeah, sorry, Kevin, that was for you. So just in terms of, we've obviously put a lot of effort into designing these indices, right? And so can you explain, kind of introducing these risk indicators, given the wider context that we're operating within, how you see these new 9 ones playing with the other
work
that that companies that are already using EiQ potentially, or that have programs set up without EiQ?
Yeah. So in the wider context, I think we're expecting to see continued deportations of workers in the US, point one. That's creating a gap in the workforce. Point two, we're likely to see increased home shoring in the US, point two. That's creating a demand on the workforce that has now got a bigger gap than before. So these shortages are going to create a lot of pressures for factories, farms, and other supplier entities. We expect those pressures to be increasingly addressed through the use of actually some of the tactics that I'd referenced above, potentially the use of labor agents, well, almost certainly use of labor agents, continued use, which will mean there are higher risks of undocumented or underage workers coming into the supplier environment. And then secondly, there'll be a lot more pressure on suppliers that do have existing workers, whether they are local or not local, to produce faster and more efficiently and more effectively. And that means longer working hours, which may predispose workers to greater risks around things like health and safety. Hence the discussion around the kind of health and safety index and data sets that I referenced earlier. So we see both of those really being potential outcomes from the current government policy and patterns, as well as the general geopolitics that are kind of impacting the US and obviously other countries as well.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And John, maybe I could turn over to you for kind of boxes 3 and 4 of the workflow, or 3, 4, and 5. You're on mute.
No problem, and thank you. Also, just to add to Kevin's point, I think we're already seeing those types of risks in, like, for example, in Canada, where actually we've migrated, where you're seeing farm migrant workers, use of forced labor tactics, and domestic workers, transparency concerns. So actually, a surprising change. When I came into this position, I didn't think that that would be, but that's actually have come up, and they have a high number of foreign migrant workers that they come in and source from other countries. So I think that pattern has a high risk of repeating once there's less domestic workers to fill the spots that we need.
And so, Jen, does that mean in those cases then that we also see challenges with recruitment fees, or are you also looking at potential challenges with recruitment fees, similar to what we see in other countries?
Yes, absolutely. Like the types of recruitment fees, like where they keep their passports, there's recruitment fees, like those types of forced labor risks that might be more common in, let's say, Taiwan or Malaysia's, the ones offhand that you wouldn't expect here, that what we have seen in Canada. And I imagine that is a very high risk of coming to the US.
Great, thanks. Sorry, now on to boxes 3 and 4.
Now on to boxes 3 and 4. Okay, so specifically, I think we're looking, as a part of your due diligence and your responsible sourcing journey, I think I think a lot of customers really like to jump into monitoring because it's the part, they think, oh, if I'm doing assessment, I'm doing the work. I actually think for these types of specialized audits and these types of risks that we're looking for, I think it's more important that we really need to set the stage. You almost think of assessments as a check on learning. But if they don't actually understand what the expectations are, if we don't set up the companies for success, I think it's going to be very hard for them to comply. And then also if they do, and it becomes a more punitive exercise. And what we don't want is this to be punitive, because we don't want it to be like they find children and they end up going somewhere into a network of human trafficking, right? We want to come up with like real remediation for how to handle those types of really sensitive and serious issues with these companies if you find it. So we don't want to scare people into doing this work. It has to be a partnership. And I think we could do like really established trainings like e-learnings and other really important, like you could do e-learnings, and we could do lots of different types of like in-person trainings. But I also just think something as basic as a one-to-one call with the suppliers before, I know that's not scalable, but sometimes it just takes a conversation. Then they understand what the expectations are. Then they're like, okay, we'll do a little bit more work here, and we'll do this, and we'll go through this process. So, and I've found that my experience has been that if companies jump into assessments, which happens quite a bit, it really drags out the process. I think the companies also, it drags out the process of getting the work done. And also I think it burns out the company too, because you think, oh, it took me this long just to get an audit plan for one service provider. How am I going to do this and scale this program? And I think if you have to have bang for your buck in like a corporate environment to say that what we're doing is impactful, you want to make sure that what you're investing your time in is going to make it. Sorry, Kevin, feel free to interrupt me.
Well, I kind of see a question coming in, which is also one that I had for you myself, Jen.
Of course.
So it feels like one of the things we're saying is, a standard audit cannot be expected to necessarily cover everything everywhere all at once.
Yeah.
Point one. Point two, we know that there are some very specific issues and topics that require further investigation, whether it's relating to unaccompanied minors, or whether it's a health and safety issues, or whether it's a labor agent related issue or an equivalent. So we therefore may need focused and separate tools that run in parallel to a standard audit program. Is that correct from your perspective on the ground, right? That a standard audit cannot
Yes.
possibly be expected to cover everything?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's happened over, since the dawn of the responsible sourcing as our industry is that the standards have become really big. And when you're on site, you just don't have the time to focus on the right issues. So if we're going to go in and look at child labor, which is a really complex issue to find and investigate, we need the time to do that. And so, you need to give people the time. And also, I think the other thing is the blind spot of the ownership of the labor agencies, because in a standard audit, you're looking at a very focused piece of it. It's like, let's check I-9s and a couple of their HR files for the people that are here. It actually doesn't evaluate the due diligence of the agency as a whole. So just because on the day of the audit, there happen to not be workers that were at risk or vulnerable, it doesn't mean that the company doesn't have those practices. And because labor agency workers are going to move between, they might not be there that day, but maybe the next day there will be a worker that is one of those, right? Because that's how those workers, it works, is that they're not always there. So we have to spend time focusing there. And I think it definitely needs to be an audit. And also I think the approach needs to be quite different in terms of how you set it up, the site visit, what's a site visit versus a call, the documentation review, all of that has to be really different. Incorporation of surveys, because you're not going to get to interview everyone. So how do you scale that type of work? I think is important. So.
I guess there's a couple things that come to mind, and some of it I see peppered in some of the questions here, but I'm going to ad lib a little bit. One is we were talking earlier about a phone call is worth it. I remember 10 years ago at that time, Elevate, right? We did pre-assessment phone calls for every single audit we did in the US. No extra charge to the client actually at that time, because we said, otherwise we just can't move forward with the audit. So there just wasn't buy-in from suppliers to do an audit, right? Like, what is the expectation? Why are we going through this?
Yeah.
What does it include? What are the penalties? Why do I have to do it, et cetera? And so, and over time, as you said, a change from 10 years ago, suppliers are actually now quite prepared for audits. It's a much smoother process.
Some suppliers, yeah.
Some suppliers. Are you saying, in terms of kind of potential solutions, are you saying, you said it's not scalable, but is it as easy as, something like that for a certain period of time, or for the first time you roll out a program? Have you seen it be done in scalable ways where there is that kind of high touch, but for a short period of time?
Man, that's a really good question. I'm not sure scalable, but I think it works. So we were doing for a pretty large company, we were doing these very specialized service provider assessments. We set up calls, and it actually took 2 or 3 calls to kind of get it around and to make it work. However, I think we baked it in, and it made sense for what we were trying to do. There was no way that we could accomplish it otherwise. And maybe it needs to be, you roll it out to suppliers that are going to be the really tough ones to do. And that's just a part of like a program management piece, that they get that one-on-one connection. Because sometimes it takes the first call just to introduce it, the second call to be like, all right, maybe I will help. And then the third call to really answer the questions and go, okay, yeah, let's do this. I'm interested in doing this.
Great. And then something else that you said, just touched on, I think, other conversations that we've had of, an auditor can't realistically dive into the complications and complexity of child labor, and also do a 300-point checklist, right?
Yeah.
However, these, really large companies need to say, we've done due diligence across all of these things across our supply base. This is our program, right? And so I think one of the things I've heard suggested, or that we've talked about is, there's two ways to go about it. Either you kind of shorten and focus your risks, your audits, and where the high audits or other interventions and where the highest risk is, right? Or you roll out a more comprehensive audit, but you treat it more as, and this was kind of coined at an auditor calibration meeting, I think sometime last year, but a commoditized audit flagging system, right? It was kind of kitsch, but like the old SMETA audits, for example, had observations. There's one retailer that, as a requirement, it confused everybody, but as a requirement, the firm doing the corrective action plan had to actually do corrective action planning around the observations. I think that worked in some ways and didn't work in others. I think it was the right idea. I think LRQA's way of addressing that is putting information in the SDS, but that's saying, hey, we're on site for 2 days, 2.5 days, whatever it is. There are these flags about the labor agencies. There's these flags about the due diligence. We couldn't dive into it with the sampling required, additional sampling, or layers beyond the required sampling. But we see it as a risk without any actual finding. And then just know that as part of your program, you should have a set level budget or kind of way to address those. Do you have any comments on that, or do you see either of those happening effectively or less effectively, of those kind of two sides of the same coin?
Let me think about it. I'm not sure if I think actually it's the right idea. That I like the idea of having, like, you have the full standard audit so you can fully understand the facility and their compliance practices, but then you have some sort of flagging system where the auditors say, like, I did an audit a month back and I thought as I was auditing them, I'm like, oh, they have these contractors, they look okay, but actually I think the management of them needs more work. It's outside of scope of the regular audit, but I wanted to share this observation with a customer to say, I think that we're missing something here. I think what you're doing in here is great, but this is actually where it is. And I can't get to it because I don't have the time unless you extend my time to do it. And I think that's the way. And also, I think for areas like specifically, immigration, which is really sensitive. I mean, these are people's lives that we're talking about that are very impacted, and it could be very, dangerous what type of results. So I think some auditors are going to put this type of information in the SDS. Like, I know that these are falsified. I know that they're illegal. I know that this, but I don't want to put that in the main report, and I'm not fully comfortable talking about with management, right? Some auditors are going to be more comfortable in that because, again, this is really impactful, very sensitive right now in a very high political situation that we have less say over. So I think given those, that's the perfect place for something like that, because then you could say outside of a standard audit, this is where we're seeing, but here is the next step, right? Because in a standard audit, you're not going to go into the hiring procedures or the due diligence of reasonable in the same way. So we can focus on it a little bit better.
Great, thank you. I think maybe we just need to go. Oh, Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to interject. I think we're kind of all very much on the same page here. There used to be a point in time, right, when so much of this was reliant just on the kind of expert auditor's judgment and the checklist. But that is not the case anymore, right? We need these flags, we need the data insights, we need helpline data. We need auditors to go in not just with what they know, but with publicly sourced information or risk analytics in their back pocket so that they can kind of be pre-warned, as well as you flagged so well, Jana and Megan, the kind of pre-audit calls can also help us get some of that information. The key point here is go in with as much information as possible because you never really know what you're going to find on the ground. And this helps really to ensure that the audit process is most effective.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. I know that we're over time, actually, so maybe we can just quick go to the last slide. And really, I think we've covered everything today. I think what's important here is we need better quality audits. We need audits covering the right thing. We need the right audit toolkits. We need all the right steps before the audit. There's some saying, which I never remember, but 80% of the work is the pre-work or something like that, right? And so I'm sure I have that phrase wrong, but you guys get the idea. And then we, of course, need to be layering in all the technology and the data. So with that, we will close out. I'm sorry that we don't have time for the questions. I see them kind of coming in here, but what we will do is we'll send around a link. Please provide us any feedback you have on the webinar as well. And then we'll also send around our emails if you don't already have them to answer any questions. And please definitely do reach out. We're here. We want to help you. So thank you so much.